Thank you all for joining us for an evening with Peter Thiel. My name is Kimberly Howe, and I'm a junior in Columbia College and a board member of CORE, the Columbia Organization of Rising Entrepreneurs. CORE is Columbia's student entrepreneurship society and is one of the largest and most active organizations at Columbia. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and launch the next wave of Columbia entrepreneurs. To that end, we organize and host workshops, challenges, lectures, and incredible speaker events such as the one you are here for this evening. Before we get started, CORE would like to thank our amazing partners, the Eugene Lang Entrepreneurship Center at Columbia Business School and Columbia Entrepreneurship for their support in making tonight's event possible. With that, I would like to introduce Dave Lerner, the Director of Columbia Entrepreneurship. Please welcome Dave Lerner.
Thank you. Thanks, Kimberly. I want to welcome everybody. It's great to see such a massive crowd here to kick off the season at Columbia. It seems like all these great entrepreneurs are kicking off their book tours at Columbia these days, which is a great tradition. I hope we continue. Ben Horowitz launched his book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, a few months ago, and now Peter's here, so we're delighted to host him. And delighted, too, to have Shane Snow, a graduate of Columbia's journalism school, co-founder of Contently, which is a company that's doing really well. And he's also put out a book that's doing incredibly well called Smart Cuts, which you'll hear more about today. A few things to say. After the discussion that we're going to have, Peter's books are going to be on sale in the back of the room. There's going to be a book signing in the green room. And I'll just say a couple other things. Columbia Entrepreneurship is an effort to harness the massive entrepreneurial energy of the entire Columbia community. It's out of the President's office. We've had a great year. We're looking forward to another great year. We're really proud of collaborating with 5 deans to open Columbia's Startup Lab down on 175 Varick Street. So Columbia is downtown and uptown now, and we have 71 alumni entrepreneurs working on 33 startups down there, so it's incredibly exciting. So listen, I just want to welcome you all. We're going to have a Global Entrepreneurship Month coming up on October 13th to be exact. And you can find out a lot about it by going to entrepreneurship.columbia.edu. So have fun tonight, welcome, and it's great to have you here. Thanks a lot. So I just want to introduce the next speaker. He's a senior at the School of General Studies. He's the president of CORE, the Columbia Organization of Rising Entrepreneurs. He's an entrepreneur himself, and he has a full-time job somehow. He's the co-founder of a music distribution startup called Track Ripple. And really, he's just a supernova of a human being. He's got massive energy. Please give a warm Columbia welcome to Andrew Satz.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here tonight. And thank you, Dave, for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank the Eugene Lang Center for Entrepreneurship and Columbia Entrepreneurship for being absolutely amazing partners in this event. As Dave mentioned, my name is Andrew Satz. I have the distinct pleasure of being the president of Columbia Organization of Rising Entrepreneurs. I'm also a senior in the School of General Studies. For those of you who don't know about the School of General Studies, it's the premier undergraduate college for non-traditional students, including veterans, artistic performers, and entrepreneurs. So Kimberly introduced you guys to CORE a little bit earlier, and so I won't make you wait any longer for Peter by explaining what we do. But I do want to talk to you guys about something amazing that's going on here at Columbia around entrepreneurship. On your seats, you should have received a flyer for the Columbia Launchpad. The Columbia Launchpad is a year's worth of entrepreneurial programming that was designed under an unprecedented partnership between the many schools and organizations here at Columbia University. Columbia Launchpad was designed to allow Columbia affiliates that are anywhere along the entrepreneurship spectrum, whether you want to get into entrepreneurship but you don't even have an idea, all the way to launching your company. Along with helping to launch people into entrepreneurship, Launchpad was designed to help students and young alumni prepare for the $250,000 Columbia Venture competition. The $250,000 Columbia Venture Competition is an amazing opportunity designed to provide Columbians with the financial support to launch their ventures. So please make sure to head to Columbia Launchpad to stay up to columbialaunchpad.com to stay up to date on all the things happening around entrepreneurship and to get involved in the Columbia entrepreneurship community. So with all those exciting items mentioned, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend, the director of the Eugene Lang Center for Entrepreneurship at Columbia Business School, Vincent Ponzo.
Good evening, everybody. I promise I am the last person before Peter gets up here on stage. Just wanted to take a second to thank Dave Lerner, thank Andrew Satz, and really thank everybody here tonight for journeying so far uptown to Columbia to hear the amazingly talented, incredibly intelligent Peter Thiel speak to us tonight. As the new director of the Eugene Lang Entrepreneurship Center at Columbia Business School, I have been very, very fortunate to have inherited a legacy of entrepreneurship that spans almost 20 years. Over the course of those many years, the Lang Center has produced entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial thinkers of all types across all geographies and across all industries. Some of those graduates have even received what might be considered the ultimate endorsement, an investment from Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, with the fund-making investments in Columbia Business School related companies such as ZocDoc, Newton, and Spotify, all of which have Columbia Business School alumni in critical leadership roles ranging from CEO to CTO to COO. So Peter really doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Peter Thiel is an entrepreneur and investor. He first gained attention for his attempt to replace the US dollar by starting PayPal, which did not achieve that ultimate goal, but which did change the way payments work and made it possible for hundreds of thousands of small businesses to thrive on the internet. After taking PayPal public and then selling it to eBay, he has become known as the Don of the PayPal Mafia, since so many of his former colleagues have gone on to start successful companies, including SpaceX, Tesla Motors, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Yelp. In 2004, Peter himself started Palantir Technologies, a data analytics company that makes tools for national security and global finance. That same year, he also made the first outside investment in Facebook, where he continues to serve on the board of directors. Today, as a partner at Founders Fund and in his own investing, he works to identify and support the next generation of technology companies. He also started the Thiel Foundation and the 20 Under 20 Thiel Fellowship, helping to ignite a debate on the differences that might exist between learning and schooling. Despite his criticism of the education bubble, in spring 2012, Peter taught a class in the computer science department of his alma mater, Stanford University. He has now revised and rewritten that class to make the new book called 0 to 1, Notes on Startups or How to Build the Future. So let's all give Peter a warm New York City welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm always. It's always a great privilege to speak in front of an audience here at Columbia, and I want to. There's so many different directions to go in. When in writing 0 to 1, I wanted to basically. The goal was to teach everything that I've learned about entrepreneurship and about technology, because I think it is critical for us as a society to be building a range of new technology companies in the decades ahead. And one of the challenges that you run into, though, when you teach entrepreneurship or write about it, is that there's something very slippery about the subject. There's a sense in which the next Bill Gates won't be starting an operating system, the next Larry Page will not start a search engine, the next Mark Zuckerberg will not start a social networking site, and if you're copying these people, you're in some sense not learning from them, and I think that all the sort of great moments in innovation, in technology, in business only happen once, and so 0 to 1 is sort of is about all these sort of singular moments where you build the first airplane or the first home computer, the first iPhone, or find like a new market like Airbnb does or like eBay did. And then the question becomes, what can you actually say that's systematic about this stuff at all? If every single moment has this sort of singular character where it's different, and what's actually really critical is what's different, and that's probably sort of where I start this book, and I basically focus on the question of there's a business version of this question I always like to ask people, which is what great company is nobody starting? And there's a more intellectual version of it that I always like as an interview question, which is just tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on. And this turns out to be a shockingly hard interview question for people to answer, because they've been taught all sorts of things that are understood to be conventionally true, and people are very uncomfortable articulating things that nobody agrees with them on. And it's not just because you have to be smart or have to figure out something new, but it's also always in sort of a social context where you have to say something. The correct answer is one that the person asking the question won't agree with or might not even want to hear. And so I think there's always, and we're living in a world in which courage is an even shorter supply than genius. And so, and yet I think it is answers to these sorts of questions that are at the core of what all these great businesses have and how they get started. My book 0 to 1 gives a whole set of contrarian answers to this question, and I'll sort of mention three major themes in my opening remarks today, and then it'd be great to sort of explore some things in more detail in the Q&A. So the first really big theme, and this runs all the way through the book, and all the contrarian answers are of the form, most people believe X and the truth is not X. So one broad answer like this is most people believe that capitalism and competition are synonyms, and I believe they are antonyms. I believe that a capitalist is someone who's in the business of accumulating capital. I believe a world of perfect competition is a world where all the capital gets competed away. And so so the restaurant industry in New York City is an extremely competitive industry, and it is extremely non-capitalistic. Nobody makes any money. And a company like Google is extremely capitalistic. It's made tons of profits for a very long time, and it's had no real competition in search since about 2002, when it definitively distanced itself from Yahoo and from Microsoft. The sort of attribute that all these sorts of singular 0 to 1 companies have goes under the sort of rubric of that they're monopolies. And I think that, and I do think that the goal of every entrepreneur, everybody who starts a company, should be to create and build a new monopoly. And we can have debates about whether this is good for the outside society. I think in some cases it is. In some cases it's more debatable. But if you want to have a successful company, it should be a monopoly. And I think this is sort of as a business truth that gets very obscured because in practice the people who have monopolies don't talk about it, and they pretend not to have them. The people who do not have monopolies, on the other hand, don't want to say that they're never going to make any money, and so they pretend to sort of have a little bit of pricing power or a little bit of something that's kind of like a monopoly. And so if the monopolists pretend not to have monopolists and the non-monopoly companies pretend to have monopolies, the apparent difference is much smaller than this real difference. And I think it's almost like this bimodal distribution. There are basically two kinds of companies. There are monopolies that make money. There are non-monopolies that do not make money. And the way, and sort of one of the ways people get at it rhetorically is that if you have a monopoly and you're trying to hide your monopoly, you will describe your market as being enormously big. And so if you're maybe a very successful search engine company, you will say that you are a technology company and you're competing ferociously on Android phones with Apple, and you're competing incredibly hard in social networking, and you're building a self-driving car that will compete with all the car companies, and there's just competition everywhere because you're in this incredibly big market called technology. And if you were to try to open a restaurant in New York City, you would say that, it's one of a kind, there's no competition at all. It is the only Nepalese-British fusion cuisine anywhere within a 10-block radius of Columbia. And so you will define your market as a very, very small market. And so I think, it's always dangerous when people tell themselves these lies. And so you need to think really hard about what are the actual markets and what are the actual things. But I think the learning within Silicon Valley is that people don't understand these business things very well at all because they're always distorted in the way in which people talk about them. Now, I think this is not just sort of an intellectual problem where people don't understand this monopoly concept or they don't understand the competition concept. I also do think there are these very powerful sort of psychological things that perversely attract us to competition and turn us away from monopoly. And it is because there's always the sense that there is safety in crowds. And so if a lot of people are doing something, then it's a good idea to do that too, even though, unlike Malcolm Gladwell, I believe there's no wisdom in crowds. I think there's generally only insanity to be found in crowds. And in practice, what you will find is lots and lots of competition. And there's sort of are aspects where I've been a big critic of parts of the education system. But when I sort of look back on my my earlier career, the retrospective was that it was super tracked, it was super sort of conventionally competitive. In my 8th grade yearbook, one of my friends wrote in that he was certain I'd make it into Stanford as a sophomore in 4 years, and that sort of happened. And then I went to law school, and then I worked at a big law firm in New York for 7 months and 3 days. If I had to do it over again, I probably would still do. I might still do some of those things, but I would ask a lot more questions why I was doing them. And was I doing them because this is what I really objectively wanted to do, or was I doing it just because this is what everybody around me was telling me to do, and what everybody said was the safe, prestigious, status-oriented track to go down. And I sort of describe myself as having had this sort of rolling quarter-life crisis during my 20s. And at some point I decided that it had sort of been a dead end, and I needed to completely restart and moved back to California and got involved in the tech boom in the late 90s, and sort of the rest is history. But I think we're all sort of strangely attracted to competition in all these different ways. The word ape already at the time of Shakespeare meant both primate and to imitate. And there is something about us that makes us sort of extremely lemming-like. It's one of the shortcuts we have for often figuring out things, but it often goes very badly wrong. Sort of the cultural version of this that I describe is that there is this very odd phenomenon in Silicon Valley where a lot of the really successful entrepreneurs seem to be suffering from a mild case of Asperger's or something like that. And I think we need to sort of always turn this around and think of this as an indictment of our whole society. What does it tell you about a society where Asperger's is a beneficial trait? Because everybody who is socially adapted will quickly, almost subconsciously, pick up on all these social cues and will be discouraged from thinking any of their original thoughts before they're even fully formed, because they will realize that the answers they have to my contrarian question, whether it's the intellectual one or the business one, they will sense that the answers to that question are uncomfortable and shouldn't be pursued, and so they will veer instead towards these hyper-competitive tracks that people seem to be doubling down on with more and more intensity every year, even though the returns on them seem to be getting less and less. Two other answers to the contrarian question. So one is the monopoly competition one. The second one that I always like to underscore is, there's sort of so if you took one step back and said, well, you have this question, tell me something that's true that very few people agree with you on. I just don't think there's anything like that at all. I think, everything that people agree on is true and everything else is just ridiculous. And I think that is actually a pretty widespread mindset of sorts. And I sort of, in my book, describe these three different categories of things. You can have conventional things, which everybody understands. You have things that are mysteries, which nobody has a clue about. And then there's things that are in between, which I call secrets, which are things you could figure out, but it's hard to figure them out. And we have a bias as a society that there are basically no secrets left. They've all been found. It's probably in some ways it's linked to globalization, I think, where there's 7 billion other people on this planet. And so you sort of think, well, there's nothing I can figure out because someone else will have already figured it out, or it's impossible to figure out. So we sort of end up with this thinking where everything is either a convention or an imponderable mystery. There's nothing in between. And when you think that everything is a convention or a mystery, where everything can be understood by a 12-year-old, and an Einstein can't learn more than a 12-year-old, that ends up being fairly demotivating. And it is true that there are some domains where a lot of things have been figured out. If you're set on becoming an explorer like people were in the 17th and 18th century, well, there are no empty spaces left on the map to go to. And so that probably will be an unsuccessful errand to find some new secrets. Or if you set out to discover a new element in the periodic table, that's probably also not a good idea for a place to look. But I think there are actually an enormous number of these things that do exist. There are sort of all these emerging fields, certainly a lot in the computer area, but I think also in many other technologies where there is quite a lot that can be done. And the truth seems to be that the people who believe that there are secrets, who believe that there are things to discover, are the people who actually will look for them and will find them. And the people who think there are none, that everything has already been solved, will not even try. And I think that there is something like this idea that you have a secret that other people don't understand. You're working on a problem that other people are not working on. That is really at the core of what drives many of these successful startups. As the introducer mentioned, we started PayPal with this new payment system, but it we had all these ideas about how with the advent of the internet you could create a completely new currency. And if you changed money, you changed the whole world in all these sort of completely fundamental ways. And I think many people find payments kind of boring and not interesting, but we thought this was the key to world revolution and world change. And it didn't quite succeed, but the focus that gave you encouraged you to sort of push in ways that you would not have done so otherwise. And my colleague Elon with SpaceX. Their secret, in a sense, is that it's possible to go to Mars, and we should become an interplanetary species. most people think that's crazy. Most people don't think it matters. But there's a subset of very talented rocket scientists who actually thought this was really important. They became convinced this was a cool thing to work on, and that was the nucleus around which the SpaceX business got built. And I think when one finds something like this that's understood implicitly by all these people, and it sort of goes very much against the conventional wisdom in our society, which is that everything's already been discovered, that maybe you can maybe if you continue working in academia, you can get a postdoc, and 10 years after your postdoc, you can work on some itsy-bitsy esoteric area, and the reality, I think, is that there are much larger areas that are within much closer reach that, for whatever reason, people are not quite exploring. Third contrarian thought for the evening. Somewhat bigger picture, and sort of another way that I use the 0 to 1 concept. I think that when we think about the 21st century, there will be tremendous progress in this century, and I think the two big drivers of progress will be globalization and technology. And I always describe these things as being on very different axes. I sort of always like to draw it as an X and Y diagram, with globalization is on the X-axis, and it involves copying things that work, or going from 1 to N, or horizontal growth. And I think of technology as doing new things, going from 0 to 1, intensive or vertical progress. And by just sort of putting them on different axes, I think it's a good way to underscore how globalization and technology are very different kinds of things in our world. There's a way in which you can think of China as a place where there's a lot of focus on globalization. California maybe is a place that's more focused on technology, and you have sort of very different kinds of things people do. Copying things works if you care about globalization. It doesn't work nearly as well for something like intensive technological progress. And if we sort of think about the history of the last 200 years, there have been periods of globalization, there have been periods of technology, and they sort of, 1815 to 1914 was a period of, where you had both tremendous globalization and tremendous technological progress. 1914 to globalization went in reverse, trade went down, parts of the world sort of seceded, got cut off in one way or another. Technology continued to progress very, very quickly. 1971, Kissinger goes to China. The last 4 decades have been a period of an enormous reacceleration of globalization, and I would argue a slower period of technological progress, an era in which there has been fast progress in computers, not so fast progress in anything else. I've often described it as a sort of 2-track technological world in which we've had progress in the world of bits, much less progress in the world of atoms. And so things like solutions to the energy problem, transportation, various areas of biomedicine, all sorts of areas like this have been much less promising areas to go in the last 4 decades, which have been a period of intense globalization and more limited technological progress. And this sort of shift is reflected in the language we use to describe our world. It would have been in the 50s or 60s, you would have divided the world into the first world and the third world. The first world was the part of the world that was progressing rapidly technologically. The third world was that part that was sort of permanently screwed up. Today, we would speak of the developed and the developing worlds. The developing world is that part of the world which is copying the developed world and is converging with it. And so this is a pro-globalization, convergence theory of history dichotomy. But it is also implicitly an anti-technological dichotomy, because when we say that we're living in the developed world, we are saying that we're living in that part of the world where nothing new is going to happen, where there's going to be stagnation, and where we can expect tomorrow to look no different from today. And I think we should be pushing back a lot harder on that. We should not accept this notion that we live in the developed world, and we should be asking, once again, the question of how can we develop the developed world? Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin by thanking Peter for his time and for his insight. It means a lot to me, as it should to each of you, that Peter chose to spend this evening at Columbia University before the members of the next generation of entrepreneurs. I'm confident that the minds in this auditorium are chock full of ideas that will take us all from 0 to 1. I'm Keith Goggin. I'm a proud 1991 graduate of the Columbia Journalism School and an occasional entrepreneur of orders of magnitude less success than Peter. I'm here tonight to introduce my fellow J School alum, Shane Snow, but first I want to give you a quick update on one of the entrepreneurship initiatives at Columbia. Last night was the grand opening of the David and Helen Gurley Brown Institute for Media Innovation. The Brown Institute, as many of you know, is the legacy of two legendary media visionaries. David Brown brought us Jaws, The Sting, and Driving Miss Daisy. Helen Gurley Brown played a starring role in the women's movement and revolutionized the magazine industry as the longtime editor of Cosmopolitan. A portion of the fortune that David and Helen amassed funds the Brown Institute, a collaboration between Columbia's J School and the School of Engineering at Stanford University. The Brown Institute is charged with encouraging and supporting new endeavors in media innovation. And that's important because innovation is interdisciplinary, it is global, and it is collaborative. Within each school and across both universities, the reach of the Brown Institute is broad. Since inception, the Brown Institute has awarded 17 Magic Grants totaling $2 million to teams of students, faculty, alumni, and postdocs from the partner schools to facilitate the development of transformative media technologies. At last night's gala, Hearst Corporation CEO Frank Bennick called the Brown Institute the best example of what a great university does, and I wholeheartedly agree. Even this early, in the veritable dawn of its existence, the Brown Institute is playing a vital role in promoting entrepreneurship at Columbia. According to Chris McGarry, one of the directors of Columbia Entrepreneurship, some of the best entrepreneurial ideas university-wide are coming out of the J School and the Brown Institute. But I know you all want to get to the interview portion of tonight's program, so I'll get to the point. Shane Snow is a 2010 graduate of the Columbia Journalism School and an award-winning entrepreneur and journalist. He is the founder and chief creative officer of Contently, a technology company with the mission to create a better media world. Contently has helped more than 30,000 freelance journalists build better careers and provides publishing tools and creative talent for major Fortune 500 brands. His writing has appeared in Wired Magazine, The New Yorker, Fast Company, and Advertising Age, and he is the best-selling author of the new book, Smart Cuts: How Hackers, Innovators, and Icons Accelerate Success. Shane has been named one of Details Magazine's Digital Mavericks, one of Forbes' 30 Under 30 Media Innovators, a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, and a member of LinkedIn's exclusive influencer program. More importantly, Shane has been named a Brown Institute Fellow and will be teaching a seminar on journalism and entrepreneurship at the Institute. Please welcome tonight's interviewer, Shane Snow.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you and Blake on writing a remarkable book. So I have at my nightstand about a half dozen business books at any time that are left half read because most business books should be about half the size that they are. And by the time I got done with this, it looked like my other business books had taken it outside and beaten the crap out of it. I took tons of notes. I felt like I took one of your courses after reading this. So congratulations on writing a great book.
Thanks.
So I'm going to start with an easy question, and we'll get to some hard questions. You're a digital pioneer. You build billion-dollar companies. Why write a book? Why write something on dead trees as someone who changes industries and changes the world?
Well, it's it was sort of a system of elimination. We couldn't yet figure out a better format to do this in. We had, I taught this class at Stanford. Blake took these notes in the class. He posted them on the internet. They sort of went viral. We got tons of people to read them. And then there was a question, what do you do next? And we thought of doing sort of like a video version of it, but I don't think people actually want to watch videos because they're about a third as fast as reading. They'd much rather just read something. And then maybe you could do it as a blog, but we wanted to get everything exactly right. And then if you're going to get it exactly right, you might as well do it as a book. We initially thought of self-publishing the book and doing it all ourselves and figuring out some internet distribution channels. But then we at the end we sort of became convinced it was still best to go with a big publisher. You get the imprimatur, and there'd be all these sort of subtle things that might go wrong if you self-publish. So it was a system of elimination, but we ended up with that as the idea.
Well, I think there's a lot of people, you're speaking to an audience, ideally, who needs to get on board with the future, and we read print books, so there's something there. So you write that, and you spoke to this, that monopoly is the condition of every successful business. So when I read that, I say, well, what about Coke and Pepsi? What about Adidas and Nike, Unilever and Procter & Gamble? How do you... You're anti-competition, it sounds like. How do you explain these companies that appear to be competitors and not monopolies?
Well, I think they're successful because they're less competitive than they look. I think these brands are quite powerful. Most people have a preference for either Coke or Pepsi. There aren't that many people who are completely indifferent whether they have Coke or Pepsi, and because people are not indifferent to it, you're able to get away with a fair bit of pricing power. Branding is one of the forms monopoly takes. It's one that I generally don't invest in because I don't feel I understand how you bring it about. But it is the somewhat mysterious thing that does happen, and when it happens, it's very powerful.
So Coke has a monopoly on people who love Coke, is what you're saying?
The market is effectively kind of divided between the two of them. Otherwise, the pricing would be much cheaper.
So when you talk about competition, and you say, so Google has this monopoly on the search industry, I think there's a lot of folks out here who are working on building companies that they realize, and so in my company, we have competitors, and it feels like once you have a good idea, the competition comes out of the woodwork. And even Google, who now enjoys a monopoly, had very stiff competition in the early days. So how do you approach sort of the building of a monopoly in your definition when the reality is there is competition, that you often can't do anything about it existing?
Well, it depends a lot on the different dynamics within the markets, but ideally, you either have a technological advantage that's big enough that people can't easily replicate it. So that's always, so we often like companies where there's some real technical talent, or there's some actually pretty hard problem, because that means people cannot simply copy it. Or you have some distribution or marketing strategy where it scales very quickly, and somehow people can't replicate this. But the model I like is that you start with one other sort of contrarian insight from the monopoly perspective that leads me to a very different way of thinking about things is the convention is always that you should look at big markets. You should go after big markets. Market size is an important thing. And I always like small markets because the way if you're a startup, you start small. And a monopoly, you have a large share of the market. So how do you get to monopoly as a startup quickly? You start with a small market, and you then get to take over that market really fast. Facebook started with 10,000 people at Harvard, and it went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. And that was a very promising start. And then that could be replicated at other colleges. And then there were people who tried to copy it sort of a year later, 2 years later, but by then it had gotten a lot of traction, and it was somehow very hard to catch up.
So investors don't like to, they don't like to invest in small markets, right? So as an entrepreneur, how do you balance that? You have to paint this big vision, tell a huge story with this reality.
Or you have to show some initial traction. But yeah, I think there was certainly a bizarre Facebook prehistory where they started the company in February. I didn't get to invest in it till summer of 2004. And it is a very mysterious question still why the various investors in Boston did not give them any money. And so I think investors systematically make this sort of mistake where if you have something that has intense traction on a small market, people will often often not like it. So there's a very interesting question why people in Boston all made that mistake early on with Facebook, and why, as a result, I was able to invest.
Tell us about that first meeting with Mark. I mean, we watched the movie, but we missed the part with, I think there's just you handing a check or something, right? How did that meeting, and what, was he dressed like a slob?
People ask this question all the time. There's actually nothing that interesting I have to say about it. It was he was very introverted. He's still kind of introverted, but he was very introverted. He didn't say very much. Sean Parker, who was played by Justin Timberlake in the movie, did a little bit more of the talking, but they had gotten a lot of traction. We'd done our homework on the company, and we gave them the $500,000 check at the end of the meeting so that they would take it from us and not from somebody else.
One of the things that I like to write about is how momentum or perceived momentum can be a stronger indicator of future success than sort of absolute success. Is that what you saw in Facebook that others didn't?
There's always, as an investor, there's always also a contrarian, the contrarian question for an investor is, what great investments is nobody making? And it's always like, why is this a good company? And then why is there a blind spot where people are missing it? And I think, so I think it was a great company because it was growing really fast. The only thing they needed money for was to buy more computers to meet the incredible demand they had at other colleges to launch. The reason why, there was, I think, several reasons people were missing it. There's probably always still a degree to which people underestimate exponential growth. Sort of the classic Einstein line that he's apocryphally said to have said that exponential growth is the most compound interest, the most powerful force in the universe. So you have something that's compounding exponentially that's very powerful and tends to get underestimated. I think the fact that it was a college site made people underestimate it because investors often like to invest in things they themselves use or understand. And since very few investors were going to college, I think they had a systematic blind spot there. So I think it's always worth asking why you have blind spots like this. And I think Facebook was probably very undervalued the first 2.5 years. They opened the site up in late -- and the mid '06 valuation was $550 million. The mid '07 one was $15 billion, and that was probably a full valuation when Microsoft came in.
So I was reading the book, and you'll notice that I'm wearing a startup T-shirt tonight because I read the line in the book where you said that you won't consider a founder who walks into your office and isn't wearing a startup T-shirt, something to that effect. And
first of all, this telephone game, it all gets slightly changed.
Yeah, something to that effect. First of all, I want to ask why you're not wearing a Palantir shirt tonight.
Well, I think there are no hard and fast sartorial rules, but it's always, I think if you're trying to promote a book in New York City, you want to sort of look like an author, and that's what I'm trying to look like tonight.
It's working. Yeah.
I think that if you're pitching a startup in Silicon Valley, if you wear a suit, it looks like you're bad at sales and worse at tech. So that's a bad combination.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, you talk about almost how a great startup in the early days is almost like a cult. I have a friend who's one of the early employees at Facebook who he listed out his life's priorities in a blog post, and it was Facebook, myself, my family. And that was his list of priorities, that he would take a bullet for Facebook before like his own brother. So you talk about this idea of building a cult at a startup, and I think the PayPal mafia, everyone talks about the places where all these guys have gone and the companies they've built. When you built that team, what were you looking for? What did you see? How did you curate that group? And what did you go through together to get to the point where these people could all go on and build successful companies?
Well, it's not quite a cult, and you don't quite want to have a mafia either. So these are, but I think you do. I do think there's always this question of the intensity of these businesses. The thing that the normal failure mode in startups is, it's way before the external competitors destroy you. The standard failure mode is internal. It's the people don't get along, and And basically, and so one of the questions I've often found to be a very good one to ask people is to ask, what's the prehistory? When did they meet? If we just met at a networking conference a week ago and we both like becoming entrepreneurs, and so we decided to join up and start a company. That sounds like, okay, I got married to the first person I met at the slot machines in Las Vegas. And you might hit the jackpot, but it's probably a really bad idea. And the good answer is more like there's a long prehistory, and we've been thinking about this for a long time. And so I do think there is sort of an intensity that when it is there is really powerful, and when it's when it's missing, you have sort of this manic depressive aspect to these startups where it's like you're going to take over the world or you're all going to get destroyed, and you go from one extreme to the other several times a day. And if you don't have things working well internally, the companies tend to blow up.
So I use this analogy a lot when I talk to other entrepreneurs that are starting companies, that you wouldn't start a rock band with 4 guitarists. And that's a lot of times what people do, especially in business school. They get their 4 business buddies with MBAs and they go start a company. You came from law. You grabbed Reed from poli-sci or something, and several dudes from various Soviet countries, and you assembled this team that was a fairly motley crew. What about these people made what you made so special?
Well, there was a longer history. So Reed joined a little bit later, but there's a group of us that were friends from Stanford. There was a group of us that were friends from University of Illinois, and there was sort of a way in which we had known each other for some time before we teamed up. There was, we were, I don't know, we liked. I don't know. It was very focused on getting a. And then you do sort of form a team. The question, when I worked in a big law firm and a big bank in New York, one of the dynamics I always disliked was that all the people that you were really competing against were the people right next to you, and so there was sort of no fundamentally friendly people around. All the people around were structurally hostile. You started a law firm. There are 80 people. Coming in, 5 will make partner after 8 years, and it's you against all of the people who you're sort of interchangeable with, and banks are very similar to that. And the goal that Max and I had when we started PayPal was we wanted to create a company where there would be some incredibly strong friendships that would be formed, we thought that. And so the question was, the question was, we didn't hire only our friends, but it was, could we be friends with these people? And that turned out to be a sort of, and this is sort of where it's beyond. It's what I describe as something you want to always move beyond professionalism. You don't want to be, sort of a law firm I remember interviewing with. One of the partners told me, all the partners hated one another, and they still made a lot of money because it was such a professional place. And I think you want to have something that's more than just professional.
That's, okay. Well, so I mean, at Contently, this strange phenomenon I have, we're about 65 people now, and I've noticed that our employees get up and leave on Friday afternoons and go to the bar together without me, and it's a strange feeling, but it's kind of, you feel almost like a proud parent, like, hey, they love each other, even though, that we're just paying their salaries. And so there's something nice to that idea.
One of the rules one of the sort of rules I heard, which I haven't checked whether it's true, but sounded plausible, was that if you have 3 really good friends at the company you're working at, you're likely to stay there indefinitely. If you have 0 really good friends at the company you're working at, you're at very high risk of turnover. Yeah. So I do think these things are very underexplored.
So here's a hard question. Star Trek or Star Wars?
Oh, that's easy. Star Wars, no question. It's like we had.
You talk about this in the book, actually.
Well, we had if you're starting a payments company like PayPal, you have Star Wars. The whole plot line is about Han Solo trying to get the money to pay off, to pay off some of the debts he has. So it's about, the money thing is like an essential plot element, whereas in Star Trek you have the transporter device that can transform anything into anything, and so it's a world where there is seemingly no scarcity and no money, and it's only mentally deranged people in the Star Trek universe who want to have money. So, that's...
And Star Wars is a very competitive environment, right? So that...
Well, you have to be careful not to push the analogies too far.
we can move on, okay. So you talk a surprising amount in the book about political issues. For a business book, I found a surprising amount. So I've had this dream for a while, ever since I saw a news report of a guy that built a floating island out of water bottles off the coast of Cancun and floated away, and no one heard from him again. I've had this dream of building a floating city. And I've heard that you've harbored similar ideas. So the question is, if you had a floating city and you could start a government anew, what would you do with that government starting fresh that you couldn't be able to do now, say, in Silicon Valley?
Well, I mean, it's almost like what are you allowed to do? I don't know. I think that I do think the seasteading floating city project. I was friends with Milton Friedman. It came to me from his grandson Patrick Friedman. And it was sort of the small side project we got involved with over the years that always generates like an almost embarrassing amount of intensity, of interest. And I think it gets a lot of interest because there's a sense that there's no frontier left. There's no place that you can go. Every part of this planet's surface is, land surface is covered by political entities of one sort or another. Outer space is probably still a little bit too far away for the time being. And so even though the seasteading thing is sort of a somewhat far-fetched project, it captures gets a lot of discussion going because there is this sense that we're living in a more ossified, more bureaucratic society where there are a lot of rules and there are a lot of things you can't do. And I think the political issue that I'm always the most concerned about is whether we are having enough technological innovation as a society. I think that in many areas there are way too many restrictions that stop us from innovating quickly. The world of bits, of computers, is mostly unregulated. The world of atoms is heavily regulated. If you got the polio vaccine today, you would not be able to get it approved. And so I think that there are a lot of biomedical areas where I think we're doing much less well than we could be.
So you think perhaps a floating island where there'd be more medical experimentation allowed?
I think there would be way more allowed, yes.
Yes. So speaking of space, in the last chapter, so I was tickled when I came to the part in your book about 10x thinking, because the last chapter of my book is actually called 10x thinking. And it's the story of Elon Musk at SpaceX when they nearly lost the company. And basically the story goes that Elon at some point told his employees, I have enough money for 3 rockets. 2 rockets failed, the 3rd rocket failed, and everyone kind of panicked. And then he, surprise, had obtained an investment from someone, a benefactor or an investor that saved the company. And now they were the first private space company to reach orbit. They're reducing the cost to go to space by orders of magnitude. Tell us about being on the other side of, that's a crazy vision. Elon says he wants to die on Mars. And you knew him, but being on the other side of that as an investor, tell us about that story of the calculus that you had looking at that scenario.
Well, we invested in SpaceX in summer of 2008, and the 2 rockets had blown up. It was a very contrarian investment because nobody was investing in rocket companies. There were, in fact, no one had any expertise in investing in rocket companies. There had been no rocket companies started in 40 years or so of any significance, and so so it was definitely very far outside the fashionable zone. But then when you actually looked at the business, the fundamentals of the business are quite good. It was one where you got paid in advance for your rocket, so it actually generates positive cash flow very quickly. They had actually quite a bit more runway than just one rocket. So they had, they'd gotten, there was this guy in DARPA who really liked Elon, and even though DARPA was not allowed to fund research into rockets, he just ordered rockets one after another, and then if it failed, he just bought another rocket. He wasn't funding the research. And so there was, we thought they had probably 4 or 5 tries left at that point.
The press story was that they're crazy, but behind the scenes, it was actually a very good business, you're saying.
It was, once we looked at it carefully, it was a much better business than even we had thought. And certainly we had a few of our LPs, LPs who had not invested in Founders Fund, voluntarily wrote us and told us that this was the dumbest investment they had ever seen. And if you know how risk-averse the limited partners who tend to run these fund-to-funds that invest in these venture funds are, for them to voluntarily say that it's a dumb idea, they have to be convinced it's just an unbelievably stupid idea.
Which for an investor like you must be music to your ears.
No, it's not. It's always, you want to be contrarian and right. It's
yeah,
most of the time.
Okay.
Most of the time, Look, I believe 1 + 1 = 2. I believe the Earth goes around the sun. Most things, I think, most conventional truths are just true.
So speaking of math, the 10x thinking thing I think is real interesting. Astro Teller of Google X says that it's easier to build a business that's 10 times bigger than just 10%, or 10 times better than 10% better. And you talk about how if you want to obtain a monopoly, you should do something that's 10 times better than just 2 times better. But the question that when I tell entrepreneurs this, people get excited, very excited about this idea, but the question always is how? How do you do something 10 times better than what everyone else is struggling to improve on?
Well, it has to be on some relevant metrics. So for example, you could say, and it's sort of a rule of thumb, but the intuition is that if it's 20%, 30% better, it's not enough to really convince people to change their behavior, because it's always technology plus the sale of technology, and the sale of technology, people don't like change. Change polls very, very poorly in our society, and so to actually induce people to change what they're doing, it has to be something that just feels dramatically different, dramatically better. I would say Amazon. It was when Amazon started as an online bookseller, they had more than 10 times as many books available as any bookstore in the U.S. That's sort of it's a sort of banal version of it, but you just have sort of 10 times in terms of diversity. PayPal, when we started, you could say that the alternative was writing checks on eBay, which took 7 to 10 days to cash, versus getting the money within instantaneously or within a few hours. And so I think there are sort of all these different ways things do. I think an innovation like the iPhone, where maybe it's just like you define an iPhone as a smartphone that just works. That's like maybe infinitely times better, since there's nothing at all.
Hundreds of thousands of apps that you can
Right.
add onto it. So they're flagging us down on time, but I have one more question from a student. So we had students come up with some questions and picked a couple, but the one that I wanted to ask you is, speaking of Elon Musk, says Elon Musk decided in college that he wanted to change 3 industries that were important problems: the internet, space, and energy. And so the question for you is, if you were sitting in one of these seats and about to exit college and going to start a company, what industry would you want to change? What problem would you work on?
I'm going to resist answering it on quite that level, because I think I never like thematic answers where it's industries or sectors, because when they're that big, there's too much going on in it. So I do think there are I'd like us to be working a lot more on the energy side. I'd like us to be working a lot more on biomedical research in various ways. But it's I always like to push back against framing it that abstractly. The great companies always have a certain particularity to them where the problem is almost the same side. There's a search problem, but search is really Google, or there's a social networking in some sense is coeval with Facebook. I mean, there's some other social networking companies at this point, but it's often a mistake to think of it on that level. Whereas, and so the problems people often talk about today that I'm perhaps the most skeptical, where it's most often framed in this abstract way, are education and healthcare IT, where where I think people broadly agree there's a lot that's somewhat off, and you have ideas about how to fix it. But if you frame it as an education startup or a healthcare IT startup, that's slightly too abstract, and it's always sort of a much more granular, much more specific kind of a framing. The area that I'm most passionate about as an area of sort of both of science and then shading into technology is the question of whether we can do things to work on longevity. One out of almost all diseases people suffer from are linked to aging. At age 30, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting cancer in your next year. At age 80, you have a 1 in 10 chance. And so I do think we could be doing a lot more on studying aging, understanding why it happens, understanding the causes, slowing it down, and possibly reversing it. And so, but that's again sort of maybe too broad a theme, even though it's something I'm very passionate about.
Maybe someone in this audience will take a very small piece of that, build a monopoly, read the book, and then
even a
help
small
solve the
piece of that
problem.
would be worth a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Peter. This has been fantastic, and again, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to Shane and Peter. Give them a big round of applause.